Alright, so when we last left off, we created a module for our checklist and we added a constructor function for the checklist that takes a selector. Alright, so now within our checklist should be responsible for creating rows that represent an order in our page, right? So in order to create a row, what we really want, right? So we're thinking object oriented. We have this concept called a row. So we want to create a row object, right? To encapsulate that object, that data. All right. So we could just put it all right here in our add row function, right? Very easy. But we want to keep our code small. This function would be very long, and I'll show you right now, right? So let's say we created all our logic and we didn't create a row object, right? So all this code here would go in this add row method, right? It'd all be here, which would make this very long. Remember I said a long time ago that maintenance is the most expensive part of software development, right? So the way to decrease that cost is to make your code more modular. Use functions. Functions should be small and do a single thing, all right? So instead of putting all that code in our add row prototype function, we're going to create a row object that represents or creates the actual row in the HTML. All right. So let's take a look at that. It's going to be a constructor function, and you should have this code as well. Remember, you can download the code for the book from the website. All right. So let's take a look at the function for creating a row. All right. So what we need to do is we want to take a coffee order that someone has created, and we want to create those elements that we talked about, the label and the input box for each coffee order that they give us. And we want to take the placeholder that we created back in the index. Let's go back and look at that index, right? Our placeholder here that has a selector, right? We want to take that and we want to append these items to that selector or to that div. All right, so what do we need to do here? All right, so the first thing we want to do is create a new div to represent our particular data order. So our row is going to take the coffee order into the constructor that we want to display. Why? Because a row is useless as it does not have any values to display. So we need to pass that to the row constructor so it knows what it should put in those values. All right. So we're going to create a div here, preparing to insert our elements into the DOM. All right. Now the syntax looks funky. Well, let's talk about this syntax. Again, this is our shortcut. This is our reference to our jQuery library. All right. So this is the equivalent of document.createElement. All right. But what we can do here is we can pass it a string, right? An HTML string representing the element we want to create. So in this case, we're telling it that we want to create a div. All right. The second argument is going to be an object containing the attributes that we want to put on that HTML. So we're saying that we want to add this attribute, data coffee order checkbox, to this div element, and we want to add this class checkbox to this div. All right, so this would be the equivalent of asking it to create this in HTML. All right, that would be the equivalent HTML. All right, so remember the first element is the HTML we want to create. Second element is an object literal, remember that from core JavaScript, containing the attributes we want to add to that element. All right, so once it creates it, we're going to store that element in the variable. All right, nothing fancy there. All right, we're going to use the same approach to create a label. All right, notice the HTML that we wanted to create, in this case a label. But we didn't have any attributes, so we don't pass it that second argument. We just want a label. We're going to store that in the variable label. All right, so we have our label that's going to store our description, right? Now we need our checkbox element. So 3 elements, a div that's going to store our label and our checkbox. All right. So there's us creating a checkbox. All right. So a checkbox in HTML is an input element, right? And what's its attributes? Well, its attributes should be the type, which is checkbox, right? So again, that's the equivalent of this in HTML. All right. Now we'll create a checkbox in HTML. All right. And we're giving it the value, and here we're using our coffee order, that email address. Well, if you think about it, we may have multiple checkboxes on the page, right? And at some point, we want to retrieve the values in those checkboxes to know which ones we want to delete or which orders we want to delete. All right. So how do we do that? We need to associate, well, what represents the order? The email address. So we want to associate that email address somehow with that checkbox. So what we can do is exploit the value of the checkbox. So we can say the value of the checkbox is the email address for that particular order. So every time we create a new checkbox, its value is going to be the email address of the order that it represents. All right. So now we've created a div to store our label to store our description, and a checkbox for the user to select whether they want to delete that order or not. We've associated that checkbox with the specific order by setting its value to the email address of the coffee order that we're trying to display. All right. So now let's create our description. Well, we'll use a string to manipulate that, right? Just string concatenation here. We create a description variable. First, we append our size. Then we add an empty space, and we check and see if the flavor is selected. If the flavor is selected, we're going to append the flavor to the description with a space. Then we're going to concatenate the coffee with a comma. Then we're going to add the description in parentheses. And then we're going to add the strength. Add the email address, and then we're going to add the strength. All right. All this is building one big description string. Nothing fancy. Break it down piece by piece and study it. All it is string concatenation. We did that back in core JavaScript on the very last assignment, assignment 4, when we passed in the, remember when we were supposed to display, actually was it 3, assignment 3, where we displayed the credit and you had the function to display it, and you passed it that object literal, and then you appended all the values to display it. All right, same concept here. All right, so now that we have our description, well, we take our label, and the label contains the checkbox. So we're going to append our checkbox to our label. All right. Our label also contains our description. So we're going to append the description to the label. So now our label element has 2 children, the checkbox and the description. All right. So now that we have our label, notice you have to do this in reverse order. Now that we have our label containing our checkbox and our description, now we want to take our label and add it to our div. All right, so now our div contains our label contains our checkbox and our description. All right, so you got this tree structure now. You have a div at the top of the tree, right, that you created. You have a label that's a child of that div, and that label has 2 children, checkbox and description. All right, so now we want to add that div that we've created representing an order to its parent. Well, who is its parent? Well, its parent is our placeholder. Well, what is our placeholder? Index. There's our placeholder right there. So how do we get a reference to this placeholder? Where did it come from? Well, here's where it came from. We pass it into our checklist constructor. All right. So now, remember that selector? Well, that's what that selector is going to be. The selector for the div we want to attach these elements to. So now it's going to append our new div, or set our new div equal to that placeholder, to that element, I'm sorry. All right. All right, so now, you should know what this does, so I won't go over that. All right, so now we've created a row or an object that allows us to create a row. We need to actually allow the checklist to add it. So we have a function on our checklist prototype, right? So we'd be able to say new checklist and then checklist.addRow, and we're going to pass it a coffee order object. All right. So what we want to do is because when this is if this row exists, we want to remove it, right? So we'll have a remove row, and we'll talk about this in a minute. All right, but we want to create a new row element representing our coffee order. So what do? We just created a new row by passing it that coffee order. What did that do? Well, that created all our row data for the HTML. Created all the HTML for us. Then we're going to append it, that row element, we're going to append it to our placeholder back into the page. All right. All right. So pretty cool stuff there. All right. So this is going to take some studying for you. All right. You got to study this to really understand how it works. All right. And studying it and just reading it is not enough. This is why I give you the assignments that I give you, because I want you to work through the code. The only way to really learn this stuff is to do it and to work through doing it. So if you don't just immediately get it as you work through it, don't start stressing it. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna fail and this and that. No, work through it. That's how we really learn this stuff. I don't really expect you to just pop out this type of code, in 30 seconds, right? Don't tell me, oh, I spent, 10 hours working. Oh, okay, well, and this is what you want to do with your life, right? If this is what you want to do with your life, well, you should be willing to spend as much time as needed to work on it. All right? If you're not willing to spend as much time as needed to learn how to do it, is this something that you really want to do? All right? So it's going to take time, and we got to work on it, and we'll keep working on it. We'll keep working on it till you really, really get it. All right? All right, so that's the add row function. When we come back, we'll talk about how we remove a row, and then we'll talk about our handlers for it. All right? Take care.